So welcome to your feast day. What is it that comes to mind when I say Christ the King or the reign of Christ? You have images of thrones and crowns of gold and castles. What comes to your mind? This day, like in all of Luke's gospel, we should know and be ready for the reversal. This day became a feast not since ancient days. It's not even been 100 years. It's been about 95 or so. It was declared a feast day in 1925 at the instigation of Pope Pius XI. He, in 1925, was looking out at the world and was concerned. The memory of World War I was still seared in people's minds. The cost, the tragedy, the horror of that. We were in the midst, we meaning Europe and the United States, were in the midst of an industrial revolution. There was not yet a 40-hour work week. The unions were yet to be. It was a time period where some were getting rich and richer still, while others barely could scrape together enough for food and shelter. It is a time period when children of all ages, if you were poor, worked. It is a time period that did not have universal access to education. Into this world, there were also, in the Pope's mind, fears about modernity, because he could look out and see what was wrong. That was pretty obvious, but he also feared some of the thoughts that were coming, some which we may or may not, I would suspect, hopefully not, agree with. He was worried about women's equality and women suffrage for the vote and other things that were along the path. So this Pope, being very human, had very real concerns that we might share, and others we might not. But into this situation, what he knew, and the impetus to start this feast, was to remind the world that above all, the beginning and the end of all, the creation of all, or in Paul's words, all that is visible and invisible comes to us through Jesus Christ. That above all, that is our foundation. And above all, Christ rules. Not another system of government, another way of looking at the world, not the way we organize our labor, or any other such thing, but that which animates and funnels to us and animates our life is Jesus Christ. Now, to some extent, I hope that your reaction to that is, well, duh. I hope at this point your reaction to that is, well, of course. And as a general principle, I think we all would kind of shake our heads and say, of course. The hard part is not that we say that. The hard part is living that. The hard part is discerning, like we might look back at the Pope and agree with some of what the Pope was concerned about, and perhaps not everything that was concerning him in that day. We have to decide and look out at our world. And we have to figure out what is of God and what is not of God. In our gospel today, we also have to reckon with what does Jesus Christ King look like? Now in Luke, the reading today is of Jesus hanging on a cross, being crucified, being killed in the most torturous way that we can possibly think of. That is the God that we says rules our life. There is no golden crown. There is no golden throne. And that is the God that we follow. So inherently, in our baptismal vows, when we said yes to those, we said yes, we would follow Jesus and imitate Jesus. And the Jesus we follow is on a path to Jerusalem to be killed. Now, I suspect, and I'm probably right, that most of us will never face or fear actually being crucified on a cross. That is not, at least for us in this room. But I would suspect that we have our own narrative of struggle, our own narrative of what is a cross. If we listen to God and listen to who Jesus is in our life, I suspect each one of us, in taking the steps like Jesus did in the world, will face struggle. You cannot help but show a mirror to the world and show God's vision of abundant life for all and not face people who will try to say no to that. You will face a struggle in trying to get that message out. You might face struggle in your own life even believing it. But that is what today is all about. Today is about saying that we walk with Christ, and the fact that we can walk this walk is because Jesus already did it. We already know the end of the story. The full promise of Christ is that this whole world and all of us in it, past, present, and future, will live in God's vision of abundant life. That is the promise of the kingdom of God. That is the future promise, that in its fullest it will be that way. And we will get to see it. Perhaps not as our time here on earth. But then again, that is not the end of us. Again, because Jesus already broke that barrier. So we have this promise, fancy word, eschatology, end time. We will hear more about them next week, because we begin our year by starting at the end. Because that is the vision where all is culminated and the promise is made concrete. But in the meantime, we get big fancy word of discernment. We get to be in prayer and think about and discern and struggle with and talk to each other about what God is calling us as an individual and us as a collective to be. In particular, at this moment in time, God is calling this church to come together as a community and to discern together about who are we. Because this walking the way of Jesus, the good news is we never do it alone. There's a reason that disciples were sent out minimally 2 by 2. There's a reason that it says, wherever 2 or more are gathered, I will be in your midst. We do not walk this path alone. We depend on each other to do that work. And in this point in time, we have the opportunity. It started over the last couple months, and in particular over the last week, in the visioning of who it is that God is calling Christ Church to be. So it's twofold. Who is God calling you to be? What is God calling you to do? And how does that fit with what God is calling collectively us to do and for us to be in the world? Now, I don't know about you, but that's a pretty exciting time, because we get to take a step back and we get to have this conversation and we get to talk to God and say, okay, God, help me to take away all these obstacles where I can't hear you and can't see you. Help me to figure out where is my place in the world. And yes, it can be scary because sometimes God answers you in ways that you're like, really? Can I take that back? Can I not do that one? Can I make it really narrow over here? And can I put a box around it? And God looks at us and said, sorry. So where we may be called to go may be a place we never imagined. That may not be physical for this collective community, but it may be opening yourself up to the possibilities. Opening yourself up to new relationships. Brandon has starting these Spark conversations. Who knows what conversation you may have that you may see the world just a little differently at the end. All of this is there waiting for us. Waiting for us to take that step and trust. Trust that God walks with us, and that is, as this feast day proclaims, that God is the beginning and the end, that Jesus is always there, that what is visible and invisible, in the words of Paul, is right there for us, and that we will walk with Jesus in the midst of us. And if we do that, then we can make however small our part and our way of putting the reign of Christ right here in this church and in Lake Oswego. So I invite you into that process. I invite you to be able to proclaim, yes, Christ is the King, a different kind of King, a different type of path. But please take that step. Say yes. And by all means, do it together.